"You do not belong in this building," Victor Hale said, loud enough for everyone in the marble lobby to hear. Claire Bennett stood near the revolving doors with rainwater darkening the shoulders of her cream-colored coat, one hand holding a leather portfolio and the other searching through a handbag that no longer contained her access card. Behind the security desk, two guards exchanged uncertain glances. Near the service hallway, Mason Reed paused beside an open electrical panel, a screwdriver resting quietly in his hand. "I already explained who I am," Claire said. "My company signed a lease for the 19th, 20th, and 21st floors." Victor gave a thin smile. "And I already explained that anyone can say that. Call the leasing office. They are unavailable. Then check the tenant directory. Your name is not there." 3 short answers. 3 closed doors. Then silence settled beneath the polished ceiling as employees slowed near the elevators, pretending not to watch. Claire could feel every curious "I'm" measuring her wet hair, her missing identification, and the humiliation Victor had carefully turned into a public performance. She had negotiated with investors, dismissed senior executives, and spoken before rooms filled with powerful people, yet none of that mattered to the man standing in front of her. To him, she was simply a woman without a badge. "Please step outside," Victor said. "You are blocking the entrance." Claire looked through the glass doors at the cold November rain sweeping across Whitmore Avenue. Her driver had left to replace the bag stolen at the airport, and her phone battery had died 10 minutes earlier. She could have shouted. She could have threatened him with lawyers, contracts, and consequences. Instead, she closed her portfolio and stood straighter. Dignity did not always sound like confidence. Sometimes it sounded like a person refusing to beg for basic respect. Mason watched Victor gesture toward the doors again. He had seen that gesture before. Contractors received it when their clothes looked worn. Delivery drivers received it when they entered through the wrong hallway. Single mothers received it when their children became restless near the reception area. Victor called it maintaining standards. Mason called it forgetting that buildings were made for people. "Sir," Mason said calmly, closing the electrical panel, "it is raining hard enough to flood the curb. Let her wait inside while you verify the lease." Victor turned slowly. His eyes moved over Mason's faded blue work jacket, tool belt, and scuffed boots. "This does not concern maintenance. Respect concerns everyone." A few people near the elevators stopped pretending not to listen. Claire turned toward Mason, surprised by the quiet steadiness in his voice. Victor stepped closer, lowering his tone without lowering his contempt. "You fix lights, Reed. I manage this property." Mason glanced at the brass letters mounted behind the reception desk, Whitmore Plaza. He had approved those letters himself 12 years earlier, after buying the building through a holding company no employee had ever connected to his name. "Then manage it," Mason replied. "Check the records before you embarrass a tenant." Victor laughed once. "A tenant? She cannot even prove she belongs here." Mason placed his screwdriver inside his toolbox and looked directly at him. "Maybe the real question is whether you can prove that you do." Mason Reed did not answer Victor immediately. Instead, he picked up his toolbox, walked toward the reception desk, and quietly placed a dry towel beside Claire Bennett. "You should not have to stand in the rain while someone checks a computer," he said. Claire looked at him with grateful surprise. "Thank you." Victor folded his arms. "Reed, I already told you this does not concern maintenance." Mason met his eyes calmly. "No, it concerns how people are treated." The lobby became silent once again. No one expected the maintenance technician to challenge the building manager, especially not in front of dozens of employees arriving for work. Victor gave a dismissive laugh before turning back toward Claire. "You have 5 minutes before security escorts you outside." Claire took a slow breath. Every instinct told her to reveal every detail of her position, every contract her company had signed, every attorney waiting to defend her business. But something about Mason's quiet confidence convinced her to remain patient. She had spent years proving herself in boardrooms where people judged her before she spoke. Today felt strangely familiar. Across the polished marble floor, Mason noticed the nervous expressions on the faces of the 2 security officers. Neither of them seemed comfortable with the situation. They were simply following the instructions of the man who appeared to be in charge. Mason understood that better than anyone. Power often sounded loud. Responsibility rarely did. Several minutes passed. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall glass windows overlooking Whitmore Avenue. Claire glanced toward the entrance where commuters hurried beneath umbrellas while the city carried on without noticing the small injustice unfolding inside the lobby. Mason quietly opened his lunch bag and removed an unopened bottle of water. "You might need this," he said, handing it to Claire. She accepted it with a faint smile. Most people would have walked away. Mason shrugged gently. Walking away is easy. Living with it afterward is harder. Claire studied him for a moment. His uniform looked worn from years of honest work. His boots carried faint marks from countless repair jobs. Yet there was something unusual about the calm way he observed every corner of the building, almost as though he knew it better than anyone else. Before she could ask another question, Victor returned holding a printed tenant directory. He placed the pages on the reception counter with unnecessary force. "There," he announced. "No Bennett. No Claire. No company under your name." Claire frowned. "Our lease was finalized yesterday afternoon." Victor smiled with growing confidence. Then perhaps someone forgot to tell reality. A few uncomfortable laughs echoed from nearby employees. Mason looked at the paperwork without touching it. "Did you check pending contracts?" Victor answered immediately. "There are none." Mason tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Why is that interesting?" Mason's expression remained perfectly composed. "Because the leasing office never removes pending agreements from the internal system until 48 hours after execution." Victor's confidence faltered for the first time. It lasted only a second, but Claire noticed it. So did the security guards. Victor quickly recovered. And how would a maintenance technician know that? Mason closed his toolbox with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than Victor's voice. "Because I have spent many years learning that every building keeps secrets. The question is not whether the records exist." He looked directly at Victor before finishing his sentence. "The question is who benefits when they suddenly disappear." Victor Hale forced a smile that looked more strained than confident. "That is an interesting story, Reed, but I do not run this building with stories. I run it with facts." Mason Reed nodded without the slightest trace of anger. "Then let us look for the facts together." Claire Bennett watched the exchange carefully. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, survived hostile board meetings, and spent years learning to recognize the difference between confidence and performance. Victor's voice remained loud, but something had changed. It was almost invisible, hidden beneath polished words and forced authority, yet she could feel uncertainty quietly entering the room. The security officers felt it too. Neither of them reached for the entrance doors again. Instead, they remained where they were, waiting for instructions that suddenly no longer seemed unquestionable. Outside, the rain slowed into a steady mist, leaving thin streams of water running down the enormous glass windows. Morning sunlight struggled through the clouds, casting pale reflections across the marble floor. Employees continued entering the lobby, but instead of rushing toward the elevators, many slowed their pace, pretending to check messages while quietly watching the unusual conversation unfold. Mason looked toward Claire. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Who handled your lease?" "A senior leasing representative named Daniel Foster," Claire answered. "We finalized everything yesterday at 4:30 in the afternoon. The legal documents were signed electronically before 5. Mason listened without interrupting. Every answer fit perfectly within the building's normal leasing procedures. Nothing sounded unusual. Nothing suggested confusion. Victor immediately crossed his arms. Anyone could memorize details from public records. Claire calmly replied, "The agreement has never been made public." For the first time, Victor did not respond immediately. The silence lasted only a moment, but it echoed louder than any argument. Mason noticed it. Claire noticed it. Even several employees exchanged uncertain glances. Mason slowly walked toward the directory screen mounted beside the reception desk. He examined the display without touching it. "Software can fail," he said quietly. "People can also make choices." Victor stepped forward. "Are you accusing someone?" Mason shook his head. "Not yet." Claire looked at Mason with growing curiosity. Most people would have tried to impress her by mentioning her company or asking for a business card. Mason had done neither. He seemed far more interested in understanding the truth than in earning anyone's approval. That alone made him different from almost everyone she had met in corporate leadership. Her attention shifted to the faded wedding band still resting on Mason's left hand. It had clearly not been removed for years. There was kindness in his eyes, but also a quiet sadness that never completely disappeared. Before Claire could ask about it, a cheerful ringtone interrupted the silence. Mason reached into his pocket and smiled the moment he saw the screen. "Excuse me," he said politely. He answered the call without walking away. "Good morning, sweetheart." Claire heard the bright voice of a young girl through the speaker. "Dad, did you remember your lunch today?" Mason laughed softly. "I did, thanks to someone who reminds me every morning. Do not forget the parent reading day tomorrow. I would never miss it. Promise. I promise." The call ended only seconds later, yet the atmosphere inside the lobby felt completely different. Claire realized she had just witnessed the side of Mason that no job title could describe. He was not simply a maintenance technician. He was a father whose greatest priority was a little girl waiting for him after school. Victor rolled his eyes impatiently. "Are we finished with family conversations?" Mason slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked at him with the same calm expression. "No, Mr. Hale." His voice remained gentle. "We are just beginning to discover who everyone really is." Claire Bennett lowered the bottle of water onto the reception counter and looked at Mason Reed with a quiet sense of curiosity that surprised even her. During years of leading one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, she had met countless people who introduced themselves by listing accomplishments, titles, and connections. Mason had done none of those things. He had offered a towel, a bottle of water, and respect. Somehow, those simple gestures carried more weight than the polished speeches she heard every week. Victor Hale straightened his jacket and forced another confident smile. "This conversation has gone on long enough. Miss Bennett, until your company appears in our system, you are not authorized to remain inside this property." Claire calmly answered. "Then let us call Daniel Foster together." Victor immediately replied, "He is unavailable." "Call the leasing department. They are in a meeting." "Call legal. They will tell you exactly what I already said." 3 quick answers arrived once again. 3 closed doors. Mason noticed that Victor refused every suggestion that involved another person verifying the information. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to make an honest man curious. Mason rested one hand on the handle of his toolbox and quietly looked around the spacious lobby. Every detail appeared exactly as he expected. The polished floors reflected the morning light. Fresh flowers stood beside the reception desk. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Everything looked welcoming except the way one visitor was being treated. He had invested years restoring this building because he believed places shaped people. Respect should greet someone before luxury ever did. Claire glanced toward the elevators and quietly sighed. "My employees will arrive soon. They will find it difficult to believe that the company they trusted me to lead cannot even enter its own headquarters." Mason smiled gently. Good leaders earn trust by remaining calm when everyone else loses theirs. Claire looked at him for a moment before asking, "Did someone teach you that?" Mason's eyes softened. "My wife believed that dignity is the one possession nobody can take unless we surrender it ourselves." Claire noticed the wedding band again and understood why he still wore it. There was love behind the quiet sadness in his voice, and there was gratitude instead of bitterness. Before she could respond, Victor interrupted with visible impatience. "If we are finished discussing personal philosophy, security can escort Miss Bennett outside." Neither security officer moved. They looked at each other, then back at Mason, uncertain which instruction carried greater wisdom. Victor frowned. "Did you not hear me?" One guard answered carefully. "Sir, Mr. Reed asked that we verify the records first." Victor's face tightened. "Mr. Reed does not supervise this lobby." Mason never raised his voice. "No, I do not." He paused just long enough for every person nearby to listen. "But every employee here is responsible for protecting the reputation of this building." Several people standing near the coffee kiosk quietly nodded. Claire noticed the change immediately. The crowd was no longer watching because a successful executive had been embarrassed. They were watching because an ordinary maintenance technician had reminded everyone that character mattered more than authority. Victor reached for the reception telephone himself and dialed a private extension. He turned slightly away from the lobby as he spoke in a lowered voice. Mason did not try to overhear the conversation. Instead, he simply observed Victor's expression. Confidence slowly faded into concern. When the call ended, Victor placed the receiver down much more carefully than before. Mason looked at him with calm, steady eyes and asked only one question. Who were you hoping would answer before the truth did? Victor Hale did not answer Mason Reed's question. Instead, he adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and forced another professional smile that no longer reached his eyes. The person I contacted is none of your concern, he said. This situation is being handled exactly as company policy requires. Mason nodded once. Then company policy should welcome another set of eyes. Claire Bennett remained quietly beside the reception desk, studying both men. Victor continued speaking faster than before, filling the silence with explanations that nobody had requested. Mason did the opposite. He listened. He watched. He waited. Experience had taught him that people usually revealed themselves when they believed silence needed to be filled. The lobby returned to an uneasy calm. Employees continued arriving, but very few walked directly toward the elevators anymore. Several paused near the coffee station. Others stood beside the large windows overlooking Whitmore Avenue, pretending to admire the morning rain while quietly following every word. Respect had slowly shifted from authority toward character, and everyone could feel it even if nobody said it aloud. Claire glanced at the digital directory once more. Yesterday afternoon, my legal department received confirmation that our tenant profiles would become active before 8 o'clock this morning. Victor immediately replied, Then your legal department received incorrect information. Mason looked toward the display screen. Systems rarely fail by coincidence. Victor laughed nervously. Now you are becoming an information technology expert too? Mason smiled politely. No, I simply spent enough years solving problems to recognize when one has fingerprints. Claire could not help smiling for the first time that morning. There was nothing aggressive about Mason's words. They were calm, respectful, and impossible to ignore. Every sentence invited truth instead of conflict. That alone made Victor noticeably more uncomfortable. One of the security officers quietly stepped closer to the reception counter. Sir, he asked Victor respectfully, should we contact the leasing office ourselves? Victor answered much too quickly. Absolutely not. The guard hesitated. Why not? Victor paused. Because they are already investigating. Mason noticed the hesitation immediately. Claire noticed it as well. The explanation sounded incomplete, almost as though Victor had invented it before finishing the sentence. Mason slowly looked around the lobby again. Every camera remained exactly where he remembered approving its installation years earlier. Every entrance recorded every visitor. Every service corridor stored electronic access logs. Buildings remembered more than people realized. They simply needed someone willing to ask the right questions. Claire folded her hands around the bottle of water Mason had given her earlier. May I ask you something now? Mason nodded. Of course. You speak as though you know every part of this property. Mason answered with complete honesty while revealing almost nothing. I have spent a great deal of my life here. It was a simple sentence. Completely true. Yet nobody understood its full meaning. Victor suddenly reached beneath the reception desk and removed a small folder. Enough of this, he declared. These are today's visitor records. Miss Bennett is not listed anywhere. Claire frowned. Visitors are listed. Tenants are not. Victor placed the folder down with visible confidence, believing he had finally regained control. Mason never even looked at the papers. His attention rested on one small detail instead. A fresh sheet had been inserted upside down near the back of the folder. It carried a timestamp from less than 15 minutes earlier. Someone had changed something after Claire entered the building. Mason quietly lifted his eyes toward Victor and asked in the same calm voice that had unsettled him all morning. If nothing needed to be hidden, why was that page replaced after she walked through the front door? SUA Victor Hale stared at the upside-down page for only a fraction of a second before pulling the folder closed. It was a small movement, almost invisible, yet it told Mason Reed everything he needed to know. Honest people protected facts. Nervous people protected papers. The lobby grew unusually quiet. Even the soft piano music drifting through the ceiling speakers seemed distant as employees waited to see who would speak next. Victor lifted his chin. You are reading far too much into a simple filing mistake. Mason answered with the same steady voice that had never once risen above a conversation. Perhaps. Then opening the folder again should solve the misunderstanding. Victor did not move. Claire Bennett noticed the hesitation immediately. Throughout her career, she had watched executives negotiate billion-dollar agreements. The strongest people welcomed transparency because truth worked in their favor. Only uncertainty feared another look. Claire stepped forward. If there has been an administrative error, I would appreciate the opportunity to correct it. Victor shook his head. There is nothing to correct. Then there is nothing to hide, Mason replied. Another silence settled across the lobby. One of the receptionists quietly lowered her headset. A maintenance worker paused beside a flower arrangement. Two delivery drivers remained near the entrance longer than necessary. Nobody wanted to interrupt what felt less like an argument and more like a lesson about character. Victor suddenly checked his watch. I have another meeting. Mason smiled politely. Meetings can wait. Respect should not. Claire looked at Mason with growing admiration. He never tried to embarrass Victor. He never interrupted him. He simply continued placing truth directly in front of him, allowing everyone else to notice what happened next. That required a kind of confidence she rarely encountered. Her own company had been fighting for survival during the past 6 months. Investors questioned every decision she made. Competitors spread rumors hoping to weaken public confidence before an important merger proposal. She had learned to expect resistance in boardrooms, but she had never imagined her hardest morning would begin inside the lobby of the very building where her employees expected to start a new chapter. Mason quietly turned toward the security officers. May I ask both of you something? They nodded. When Miss Bennett entered the building, did she behave respectfully? Yes, sir, one guard answered. Did she cooperate every time someone asked a question? Yes, sir. Did she threaten anyone? No, sir. Mason looked back toward Victor. Then the only issue remaining is paperwork. We should never forget the difference between verifying information and questioning someone's dignity. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. Those words reached her more deeply than she expected. Since becoming a chief executive officer, people often admired her success before knowing her character. Mason had done the opposite. He defended her humanity long before learning anything about her accomplishments. At that moment, a notification sounded from the reception computer. The receptionist looked down at the monitor with a puzzled expression. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard before she quietly spoke. Mr. Hale, the tenant database just registered a system synchronization. Victor immediately stepped closer. Do not open it. The receptionist looked confused. But it says several pending lease files have appeared. Mason did not look at the screen. Instead, he watched Victor. Sometimes the truth announced itself before anyone even read it. Victor's face lost its color as another notification appeared beneath the first, displaying a secure administrative access request that could only be approved from one place inside the building, a private office that very few people even knew existed. The receptionist slowly looked up from the glowing monitor, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, the system is requesting owner-level authorization. The words floated through the lobby with unexpected weight. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Victor Hale walked toward the computer so quickly that his polished shoes echoed across the marble floor. Cancel it, he said. Do not open anything until I approve it. The receptionist hesitated. I cannot. The request says local authorization has already been accepted. Victor frowned. That is impossible. Mason Reed quietly closed the lid of his toolbox. Very few things are impossible, he said. They are usually just unexpected. Claire Bennett watched Mason with growing curiosity. Since the morning began, he had never looked surprised by anything that happened inside the building. Every hallway, every policy, every electronic system seemed strangely familiar to him. It was as though he had been waiting for the truth to catch up with everyone else. A soft chime sounded from the elevator bank. The private elevator located behind the decorative stone wall, one that almost nobody in the building ever noticed, quietly descended toward the lobby. Several longtime employees exchanged puzzled glances. That elevator was rarely used. Most people believed it connected only to executive storage areas. The security officers instinctively stepped aside as the polished doors opened without a sound. An elegant woman with silver hair stepped into the lobby carrying a slim leather portfolio. She walked with calm confidence, acknowledging no one's curiosity until her eyes settled on Mason. Good morning, Mr. Reed, she said warmly. I apologize for the delay. Mason smiled politely. Good morning, Eleanor. Claire noticed the immediate change around the lobby. Several longtime employees recognized the woman at once. although many had only seen her a handful of times over the years. Eleanor Price had represented the ownership group of Whitmore Plaza for more than a decade. She almost never appeared without an important reason. Victor forced another smile. "Miss Price, thank you for coming. We have a minor misunderstanding involving a visitor." Eleanor looked at Claire before turning back toward Victor. "I reviewed the security notifications while writing down." She paused briefly. "This is considerably more serious than a misunderstanding." The lobby became completely silent. Even the coffee machine seemed unusually loud against the stillness. Eleanor opened her portfolio and removed several neatly organized documents. "At 7:42 this morning," she said calmly, "someone manually removed an executed lease agreement from the active tenant database." Claire recognized the first page immediately. It carried her company's name and the signatures completed the previous afternoon. Eleanor continued. "At 7:47, the visitor log was edited. At 7:49, an internal access request attempted to prevent automatic synchronization with the secured ownership archive." Victor's face turned pale. "There must be an explanation." Eleanor nodded gently. "There is." She closed the folder before looking toward Mason with unmistakable respect. "The ownership archive cannot be altered without notifying the owner directly." Claire slowly turned toward Mason. Employees followed her gaze. The security officers did the same. Nobody seemed willing to breathe. Eleanor smiled softly before speaking the sentence that changed everything. "Mr. Mason Reed reviewed every notification personally before I arrived because Whitmore Plaza belongs to him." The lobby fell into complete silence. Nobody looked at the marble floors anymore. Nobody looked at Victor. Every eye rested on the quiet maintenance technician who had never once needed to raise his voice to prove where he truly belonged. For several long seconds, nobody in the lobby spoke. Victor Hale stared at Mason Reed as though he had never truly seen him before. The worn work jacket, the scuffed boots, the toolbox resting beside the reception desk, every detail remained exactly the same. Only one thing had changed. The assumptions surrounding them had quietly disappeared. Claire Bennett looked from Eleanor Price to Mason, searching his face for any sign of satisfaction. She found none. There was no smile of victory, no expression of revenge, only the same calm dignity he had carried from the moment she first stepped through the revolving doors. Eleanor gently placed the lease agreement on the reception counter. "Miss Bennett," she said warmly, "your company completed every requirement yesterday afternoon. The agreement has always been valid. The archived records were never altered. Only the local system was." Claire released a slow breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. "Thank you." Mason looked toward her with a gentle smile. "You never needed to prove that you deserved respect. You deserved it the moment you walked through those doors." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment. Those words reached deeper than any public apology could have. Throughout her career, people often respected her title before respecting her character. Mason had done exactly the opposite. He had defended a stranger because she was a person, not because she happened to be a chief executive officer. Victor finally found his voice. "Mr. Reed, I can explain everything." Mason turned toward him without anger. "Then explain it honestly." Victor looked around the silent lobby. Every employee, every security officer, every receptionist was listening. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier that morning had completely disappeared. "I received a phone call before the building opened," he admitted quietly. "Someone said Miss Bennett's company might lose its financing before the end of the week. They suggested delaying access until the situation became clearer." Claire frowned. "Who called you?" Victor hesitated. "A representative from another investment group." Eleanor closed her portfolio. "That investment group attempted to purchase the remaining office space last month after your company signed its lease. They were informed the space was no longer available." Claire immediately understood. Delaying her company's move into the building would have created uncertainty among employees and investors at the exact moment her business needed confidence the most. Mason listened without interrupting. When Victor finished, another silence settled across the lobby. Finally, Mason spoke. "A building is more than steel, glass, and concrete. It becomes part of someone's future. Every family working inside these offices trusts us to treat them fairly. That trust is worth far more than any lease agreement." Victor lowered his head. "I failed that responsibility." Mason nodded gently. "Yes, you did." No anger followed those words. No humiliation. Only truth. Mason turned toward Eleanor. Please place Mr. Hale on administrative leave while the investigation is completed according to company policy. Give him every opportunity to cooperate fully. Eleanor answered without hesitation. It will be done. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. They expected public punishment. Instead, they witnessed quiet accountability. Claire watched Mason carefully. The power he possessed was real, yet he used it with remarkable restraint. As the tension slowly dissolved, the receptionist looked back at her monitor and smiled. Miss Bennett, she said, your company has officially appeared in the tenant directory. Welcome to Whitmore Plaza. Mason picked up his toolbox as though the morning had been entirely ordinary. Before walking away, he looked at Claire one more time. I believe your team has been waiting long enough. Let us make sure the first day in your new building begins the way it always should have, with respect. The lobby of Whitmore Plaza slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the people inside it never looked at Mason Reed the same way again. News traveled quietly through the building during the following weeks, not because Mason encouraged anyone to tell the story, but because genuine character always found its own voice. Employees spoke less about the moment everyone discovered who owned the building and more about the moment he handed a towel and a bottle of water to a stranger who had been treated unfairly. That was the part people remembered. Claire Bennett officially moved her company's headquarters into the 19th, 20th, and 21st floors exactly as planned. Her employees quickly noticed something unusual about their landlord. Every few days they would see Mason replacing a light fixture, checking a heating unit, or greeting janitorial staff by name. He never announced who he was. He simply worked beside everyone else, believing that leadership became meaningful only when it remained close enough to understand ordinary people. Several weeks later, Claire found Mason repairing a loose handrail near the employee cafeteria. Most owners would hire someone else to do that, she said with a smile. Mason tightened the final bolt before standing. Most owners probably could. Claire laughed softly. Then why do you still do it yourself? Mason looked around the busy hallway where hundreds of people passed each day. Because every person who walks through this building is trusting someone they will probably never meet. I think that trust deserves a face. Claire stood quietly for a moment before saying, You changed more than my first day here. Mason looked surprised. Claire continued, After what happened in the lobby, I asked every manager in my company to review how we welcome new employees, visitors, delivery drivers, and contractors. We discovered that respect should never depend on a job title. We changed our policies because of one conversation you probably thought everyone would forget. Mason smiled gently. Then something good came from a difficult morning. Winter gradually gave way to spring. The trees lining Whitmore Avenue filled with new leaves, and sunlight poured through the enormous lobby windows where strangers had once watched an act of quiet courage unfold. One Saturday afternoon, Mason arrived holding the hand of his daughter, Lily Reed. Claire happened to be meeting with her design team when she noticed them near the fountain inside the atrium. Lily ran toward her with the easy confidence only children possess. You are the lady Dad helped, she said. Claire smiled warmly. Yes, I am. Lily looked proudly at her father. He says every person deserves kindness before they earn anything else. Claire glanced at Mason, whose expression revealed equal parts humility and love. Your father taught me the same lesson, she replied. A few months later, Mason and Claire stood together in the renovated community conference center on the first floor as local families gathered for the opening of a new career mentoring program sponsored jointly by Whitmore Plaza and Claire's company. The program offered free professional workshops, interview coaching, and childcare support for single parents searching for better opportunities. Mason insisted that no banners carry his name. Claire insisted the welcome sign display only one sentence. As guests entered, they paused to read the simple words written across the entrance. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. Mason looked around the room filled with hopeful faces before quietly taking Lily's hand. Claire stepped beside them, grateful that one rainy morning had begun with injustice but ended with purpose. Sometimes the greatest proof of strength was never hidden inside wealth, authority, or recognition. Sometimes it appeared in the quiet decision to defend another person's dignity before anyone knew who they were, because true character never waits for titles before choosing kindness.